Hello out there, and I wanted to take a few minutes today and have a quick discussion video about overpriced knives and the things that we perceive to be more expensive than they should be when maybe in fact they aren't. And the inspiration for this video came from a lot of the feedback that I got about the Spyderco Drunken, which I talked about a couple weeks ago on the channel. And yeah, that's an expensive knife, guys. I'm not even going to begin to debate that. That is a $410 knife. But a lot of the comments were talking about how overpriced that knife is. And the more I thought about that, the more I just disagreed. And while my opinion is no better or no more valid than anybody else's, I wanted to take a few minutes and just talk about my perspective on this topic. And even though it might be a little bit nitpicky with like choice of words, just sort of explain where I'm coming from when it comes to the way that knives are priced, especially once we get into that higher end kind of level of production. And what you'll see in front of you today is stuff that isn't really quite there because I don't really have any of those knives myself. The Drunken, which I had, was only mine for a few days. I couldn't hold on to that. I can't afford to buy knives like that all the time. And as much as I wish I could, it's just not the kind of knife that I'm able to get. And it's not the kind of knife that Spyderco markets to people like me. And we'll get back to that in a bit. But starting with some of the comments and some of the things that I was hearing, I don't think that it's overpriced. I think that when I look at knives that are expensive, the first thing that I have to do is compare them to other things on the market that are comparable. You know, there are plenty of knives, let's say Benchmade 940, 943, these are $165, $170. There are plenty of other S30V knives with similar materials, maybe even better materials that are around the same price. And at the end of the day, if it's an extra 20 bucks or 20 bucks cheaper, what's going to end up happening is your desire, your preference for the design or some other aspect of the knife is what's going to drive you to make a purchase or not compared to some of the other similar things on the market. And getting into the Drunken when it comes to that, that's a $410 knife, but I cannot think of a single production knife really that I've had, at least, that has been on par with the level of craftsmanship that that knife had. So saying that it's overpriced, I mean, maybe it's more expensive than what you need, but there aren't a lot of things out there that are done better for cheaper. The only one that really comes to mind is the Todd Begg Steelcraft Mini Bodega that I had, and that had a ton of high quality machining on it. I'll try to insert a picture if I have one. Just great work on the titanium and on the blade itself and on the clip and inside. I mean, just a lot of extra details, and that was a $450 knife. You know, and what I thought about the Drunken was that, man, it's got all that extra machining on the carbon fiber, extra on the titanium. This is the kind of knife that if you have the $400 to spend on a Sebenza and you don't like the Sebenza design, then maybe you go in this direction. You know, and it's Spyderco just performing at their highest level. And that's really the way that I saw it. I didn't see it as an overpriced kind of knife. Just something that was out of my budget, but that doesn't make it overpriced. You know, what I would have liked to have seen with that knife, and I think what a lot of people were sort of hinting at, was that they would have loved that design with maybe fewer intricacies, fewer embellishments at a cheaper price point. You know, if you take that Spyderco Drunken, still have the same materials, but with less machining, maybe even dumb down the steel to S30V, you could have that knife right around the $200 price point, and it stays a cutting tool. What I think happened, though, with it, with the level of detail that they went to, is that it reached that level that it's no longer really a cutting tool anymore. You know, I look at a knife like this, this Para 3, sorry, and it's got really great carbon fiber. I've made a video about this carbon fiber. There was a blade swap on this, so whatever. But it's got great carbon fiber, but it's still, at least in my estimation, designed and executed with the intention of being used. This is still, for me, a cutting tool, even though it's expensive material and it's done in a way that carbon fiber usually isn't. It still is, to me, a tool more than anything else. But once you go any further from here, closer to that drunken, closer to that mini bodega, you start to I guess, broach the area where you're no longer talking about a cutting tool and you're talking about more of a piece of art. And it might be a functional piece of art, but for me, the drunken and that mini bodega that I had, they were knives that I was never really going to want to use. I wasn't going to want to cut with those. Those seem to me to be more artistic pieces than anything else. You take a look at my Chris Reeve and Cosi. I carry that. I cut with it. I don't worry about scratching it up. It's an expensive knife, but it doesn't look like an art piece. And even though the level of detail and craftsmanship on that knife is very high, it doesn't look like it shouldn't be used, if that makes sense. At least that's my perspective. And I think, once you cross that certain level, though, further from stuff like this, you get more and more into knives like that, where they're just so detailed and so expensive that you don't necessarily see them the same way that you see just a beater, or even not a beater, but just a high-end user kind of knife. So that's something always to keep in mind, and I think the design of the drunken was one that would definitely lend itself to a user kind of mentality, but just the way that they chose to execute it didn't create a final result that a lot of people would have access to. And for that reason, and just for the looks of it, it seems to be more of an art piece. Now, this isn't me saying that I don't think that there are knives that are overpriced. There are plenty of knives that I look at as overpriced, but it's all about perspective, and it's all about the things that I value, and it's all about, comparing materials. When I think about overpriced knives, the first things that jump into my mind are some of the Spydercos from Seki City, Japan. Some of those, like the Ouroboros from a few years ago, the Paul Alexander design that was $160 or something like that. Had VG10, it had G10 handle scales, nothing really too impressive, and the design itself was just sort of But then you see some of the Paul Alexander designs that went to Taiwan, like the Sliver Axe and the recent Akuchi, and those are both cheaper than the Ouroboros with much better materials. That makes me see that the Ouroboros, at least in my estimation, is overpriced. Now, if you love the Ouroboros and that's the design you have to have, then you're going to pay that money and you're not going to think it's overpriced. So again, there's just a bunch of different ways of looking at things. I immediately jumped all over CRKT when they announced that recent limited edition knife that was like $750 or something like that. But it has CTS XHP, which is a pretty darn good steel, and it has that new deadbolt locking mechanism. If you have a lot of money and those are two things that you value, maybe it's not overpriced for you. I don't see a world existing where it would not be overpriced to me, but those aren't things that I value that much. And some people out there really do value them. So again, it's all a matter of perspective. But when I think when people were saying that the drunken was overpriced, they're just saying that it's just not what they need in a knife, and it's not what they're willing to pay. The question I always ask when people say it's overpriced, instead of saying, what do I think it should cost, I always like to say, what would they have to do to make it worth that much money to you? What would Spyderco have had to do to make that knife worth $410 to those of you who thought it was overpriced? It's just an interesting question to ask. It's an interesting thing to think about. And whenever I think about stuff like that and I reflect on stuff like that, I realize, hey, there's nothing they could do. I was never going to want to buy that knife. The same way that, and I always go back to cars when I'm when I'm doing comparisons with knives. The same way that with a car, you know, I might think that a Ferrari is like the best car on the planet, but like I don't need it. I don't need it for what I use a car for. So I don't value a lot of the qualities that make a Ferrari so expensive and make it so great. Would I love to have one? Sure. Am I ever going to be in a position to pay that much money for a car? No, because it's not what I want to do with my money. Because for me, getting from point A to point B with air conditioning and music is really all that matters. You know, and for a lot of us with cutting tools, we just want something that's going to feel good in the hand and give us a good material and be decent priced. And so a lot of people, regardless of how good that Drunken looked, they just didn't value that level of machining and would have preferred a knife maybe with carbon fiber on this level, which is still really awesome, you know, with titanium on the other side. And again, maybe S30V steel instead of S90 and a $200 price point. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Drunken, like, Spyderco doesn't really care. You know, they didn't... Honestly, when it comes to a knife like that, I think that Spyderco did exactly what they wanted to do. And there were people saying, oh, it's not going to sell, it's not going to, like, it's going to be a big failure. I don't think Spyderco was worried about it selling at all. I think they had a specific idea with that knife. They wanted to manufacture their balls off and make the best looking knife that they possibly could. They knew that there would be obsessive Spyderco fans or obsessive Dmitry Sienkiewicz fans or people with money to spend on a knife that don't like Sabenzas. They knew that they'd sell enough of them in order to, you know, do whatever they needed to do financially. But I think they had ulterior motives, and they were not even remotely concerned that the regular kind of person or people like me wouldn't be able to afford that knife. That was not their goal. I was not the goal, like, subject. I was not the market for that knife. Just the way that it was. So, yeah, I think at the end of the day, that knife wasn't overpriced at all. It just isn't for a lot of people in its current, you know, in the current variety, I guess, that they have executed it. Hopefully they dumb it down a little bit, because I thought it was an awesome design, and I'd really like to see more with Sienkiewicz and in that design, maybe at a better price point, and like I said, some dumbed down materials. But they might not do that, and that's perfectly fine. There'll be more things, and we'll be able to debate those in the future as well. Really like to hear your take on this, guys, and I'd love to hear if you think that I'm spot on or way off, or what things I'm missing when it comes to this debate. All right, thanks very much for watching, though. Any other questions, comments, complaints, suggestions, let me know down below. I appreciate it. Take care and have a good one.